and we are a nonprofit institution at the university. We don't receive any funding from either the state or the university. This entire series is actually being brought to you through funding from grants, most notably the LCBC Enterprise Fund. So we want to thank them, and as well as we want to thank our partners with the Vermilionville Foundation. Just to give you guys a little bit of background about the center, it was created in January of 2001. The director, Carl Brasso, was given a computer, a graduate student, some office space, and was told to do something. And what he did was he created an annual conference, which we host every fall. We always host it right before Festivals Acadiens at Creole. So when it moved from September to October, so did our conference. He also created an extensive online tourism guide, ccet.louisiana.edu, which contains over 2,000 pages of information about Louisiana, its people, its history, its culture, its environment, as well as we provide visibility on the internet for every single parish in the state, especially those who don't otherwise have an internet presence. In addition to that, we also have 32 research fellows associated with the center, and they represent 5 colleges and 7 departments on campus, as well as 7 outside organizations, including the Natural History Museum here in town, Louisiana Department of Culture, Recreation, and Tourism, independent filmmakers, Louisiana Public Broadcasting, and the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. In addition to that, we do community outreach, of which this is a part of our mission here, which you guys are experiencing tonight. And we also conduct field work and add to our archives, which is the Archives of Cajun and Creole Folklore. Many of you probably have heard about it, or our CD series, the Louisiana Folk Masters series. We have 3 CDs out right now: Maurice Connor, Women's Home Music, and Festivals Acadiens 1981 Live. We're working on a double disc that will be debuting this fall at Festivals Acadiens at Creole, and it will be Canray Fontenot and Dennis McKee. And that's about all I can tell you right now. It's all very much in the works. So that's what we do, and we're really glad to have all of you guys here, and we hope you guds keep coming out. The next installment in the series is August 11th, and we will be having Joe Hall and Herman Fuselier talking to us about Creole musical roots. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jim Delahoussaye. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. If I'm too loud, somebody needs to let me know that. Okay? I'm so pleased to see so many old friends out there and so many old friends I haven't met yet. So I'm looking forward to meeting you if you get a few minutes after this talk. I'm also delighted to have 90 minutes to tell you a long story about the Atchafalaya Basin and this group of people that we're going to talk about. Most of the time this talk is reduced to 20 minutes, and you can't really do very much with that at a conference or a meeting. So I'm delighted to have 90 minutes to spend with you this evening. It is about the Miette Point community, a group of people in the Atchafalaya Basin that led what I thought was an extraordinary set of lives over a period of time, much of it in houseboats. I'm looking at this picture realizing that I put this picture up here because it looks to me, which it is, the sun rising through a fog bank on the Atchafalaya River. It just goes to show you how you can be wrong by your impression. Andy Brasseur told me yesterday it looks like a nuclear explosion over Baton Rouge. Nah, it's a sunrise, ain't it? I'm going to try to go through this material at a reasonable pace. I have reasonable expectations that I will not get through it. If I get close to 15 minutes to go, my wife is going to jump up over there, wave her arms, and threaten to haul me off away from the microphone. So we'll try to do the whole thing, and if we can't, we'll do the best we can. So, the Miette Point community, land to water to land. A physical setting on the scene that we're talking about tonight, the geographical setting. The reason I have both ways on this is this picture is, of course, a recent picture. This is not an old picture of the basin, it's a recent picture. But it shows the basin both for what it was before the levee system was developed and after. If you look at the, I have a pointer, but I only have two hands. Let's see. This set of lines right here, I hate people who jiggle when they do this, don't you? And there's no way I cannot do that, so please bear with me. I'll try not to keep it on very long. This set of yellow lines is the basin levee system. It defines what we think of today as the Atchafalaya Basin, that which is within the levees. But of course, that's an artificial demarcation. Those levees define a Corps of Engineers designed spillway system, not a natural basin. The natural basin is everywhere you see the brown edge. All of this was the original Atchafalaya Basin. What would you say, about twice the size of what the basin is now between the levees? So we have both ways, the Atchafalaya Basin. Other than the physical setting, we have the cultural setting of the basin, which is defined primarily by, of course, the people who lived in the basin, what they did, who they were, so on. These three books are probably the foundation for what we know about the culture in the Atchafalaya Basin. The one in the front, the brown one, I know the title is difficult to read, but it's Atchafalaya Basin Swamp Life, Atchafalaya Swamp Life. And it's probably the foremost authority from 1973 on what folk life was like in the Atchafalaya Basin. It's an extraordinarily good book. Some of you may have heard about the Bayou Chene story. Bayou Chene was, of course, a community in the basin that had an existence, a communal existence all its own. Courthouse, taverns, which doubled as funeral parlors, depending upon whether it was Saturday night or Monday morning. And Cajun Families of the Atchafalaya, one of the several books that someone you know, Greg Gerard, has written. Greg has done some wonderful work on the people around the Catahoula region. Extraordinarily good thing. I have these three books here, if any of you are interested in looking at them after this time together. You're welcome to come up and do that. So, we know about Bayou Chene, we know something about Catahoula, we know about the basin in general from the Swamp Life book. So what does the MEAD point information add to all of this? Well, what it adds is a pretty unique situation. We have a single group of people, all living in one place, all subject to the requirements that the basin exerted on people for the whole range of life. And on top of that, almost all of them lived for at least 50 years on houseboats. Houseboats are what intrigued me about this whole thing, because houseboats require a whole different way of looking at life. See a gentleman nodding his head right there, he knows what I'm talking about. They're not big. I wanted to bring and forgot to bring a set of tape, some of that police tape. I wanted to tape out a 30 by 15 stretch piece of floor for some of you here to sit within. And you would be sitting in a houseboat for this whole talk and divide it into 3 rooms and see what you think about the size of the thing. And then think about having 8 or 10 kids in there with you the whole time, the whole lives. Extraordinary set of adaptations to living on houseboats, especially during the time that these people did. The source of this material, it's personal. This material comes from a collection that I've done and my wife Carolyn has helped with a great deal. Starting in 1974, I began taping this material at people's tables, drinking coffee in the morning. In the old, most of the time, they were houseboats that had been brought up on land and put on blocks. From 1974 to now, I think I have 65 tapes now. This material that we'll be talking about tonight is from transcriptions from the first 33 of them. The first 33 tapes have 1,400 pages of transcription. So there's a great deal to talk about even in 90 minutes. The talk plan, what I'd like to do with you is start off with giving you an introduction into the community as it existed in 1974 when it was still on the levee. We'll talk about why that changed. But in 1974, they were still on the levee. And then I'd like to drop back to the 1800s and bring you forward through the 1800s to the 1900s to finally bring them back again to place them on the levee in 1974 and try to help understand how they got to be where they were. There are 4 generations of people involved here. The first generation was born about in 1850. Obviously they're not on tape. But what they are is they are the direct memories of those people who were their children and grandchildren. And those people had memories. They had good memories. They couldn't read or write for the most part, but they could tell you almost anything that happened from almost any time in the past, and verified with other people too. So we have 4 generations of people. The limits to what this information, I think, at least in my opinion, the limits to what this can be used for, is that this is only that one community of individuals, that one set of families that lived on the levee at Miette Point. This is not something that I'm trying to compare to Baishane or to Morgan City, Caterpillar, or anybody else. This is that one isolated, and it was, isolated community of people at Miette Point. I'm going to use this map all evening with you. It is the 1863 map of Grand Lake in the Atchafalaya Basin by Abbott. No doubt there are better maps than this, but this is the one that I started with, and I like what it does. You can see that in 1863, Grand Lake was this big, wide open. From here to here is about 5 miles. From up here to down here is about 30. Wide open water in 1863. A big body of water. So we'll be talking about these bayous up on this bank right here. We'll be talking about these areas around Bayou Sorrel, and we'll be talking about Miette Point, which is what the green arrow points out. This is Miette Point before anybody was associated with it. This is the same place in 1974. Notice there's no open water. We know that. The basin was silted up, and there's no open water in 1974, but relatively almost no open water. Mios Canal and Miette Point is going to be a focal point for this whole talk. Now, up close, this is what Miette Point looked like in 1974. These were the land farms in 1974. We had the levee, which of course is the red. We had sugarcane right behind the levee, all of it sugarcane. We had the old swamp was just the edge of the lake. This much right here was the old swamp being the original Cypress tubulum habitat. Everything else in here, well, not Goat Island, but all of this, all of this, all of this, all of that sandbar, 1974. That's the setting for the community that we're talking about. And they lived, and we'll see this in much more detail in a minute, but they lived on the back side of this levee right here. And here they are. In 1974, this is what the community looked like in terms of placement of houses, all along the back side of this. Remember, Mead Point is this thing that stretches out up here. The man whose family, just as an aside, the man whose family is responsible for having their name on this place, Mead, probably is going to dislike me for the rest of his life because I haven't changed this name back to the way it should be, which is his family name, spelled M-I-L-L-E-T. The original name of this point was M-I-L-L-E-T Point. And when the Corps of Engineers decided to start making quad sheets of this area in about 1935, they named everything and they changed the name to this, Mead, M-Y-E-T-T-E. And Bootsy Mead is still upset by that. Rightly so, I think. There were 32 households in the community when I met them in 1974, and here they are all, each house has been named for its ownership. We have a lot of information about these folks. The primary family names that we're talking about now, these are not, some of you will recognize some of these names, of course. These are not all the people who lived on Mead Point, but these are the families from which most of the households were derived. So there's different names for people who married into other families and so on. But the Covilliers and a group of these people that ended up in this community began in the north side of Grand Lake, and another group began on the south end of Grand Lake. And they happened to come together finally in a way we'll see in a little while in this community. The families like Cuvillier, Lang, and Sanders were all from the north end of Grand Lake. Hog Island is a name you'll hear a lot tonight. Bayashane, not so much, but these are places in the northern part of Grand Lake. The origins of these families, the Cuvillier family was from France in 1730, and then you can see the mixture of others. Germany is in there, I say Kentucky and North Carolina for the Baileys, because those particular families have not been traced beyond that yet. They, of course, could be. And 4 Mile Bayou is in the south end of the basin, so is Bayou Long. But those are the family names: Villiers, Lang, Sanders, Bailey, Daigle, and Sauce. This is the placement of those areas where they came from, Bayashane and Hog Island. Remember this base map? There's Grand Lake, Mead Point, Franklin, if you want one, is right there, I should say. Morgan City is over here, and we'll see this in a minute. Bayou Long and 4 Mile Bayou are down here. They all began there with one of those two places. Just for reference, those of you who have been in the basin who know any of these names: Morgan City, 4 Mile Bayou, Bayou Booty, Blazes Canal or Williams Canal, Big Pigeon, Little Pigeon, Keelboat Pass, Bayou Sorrel, Bayou Shane, Hog Island. Hog Island has a lot to do with this, and Meos Canal, Mead Point, okay, Franklin there. So, we have transitions that took place with these folks. From land to water to land, of course, implies a transition. First transition in this case had to be from people who were living on land who, for one reason or another, decided it was to their advantage to live on the water instead, with all of the modifications to lifestyles and so on that had to come with that. So, from land to water was the first transition. Why did they do it? Why did they go from land-based places to live on the water? Family drift was one. People who moved away from their parents or grandparents left those older people in those places on the bank, and eventually the older people found that rather than stay there alone, they preferred to be near where their children had gone. So they too moved on to houseboats, either individually or with their children. Following the fish was another reason why people moved on to these houseboats. These people had been fishermen for a long time already, And it was easier to move to the fish if you could move your house with them. Independence. These are very independent people. I know you've heard stories about fishermen in the Atchafalaya Basin. They don't get along with anybody. It's because they all know they're right. And bless their hearts. They say you can say anything about anybody if you say bless their hearts first. Right? Okay, bless their hearts. Very independent people, my friends. Economic pressure. Much of the movement onto houseboats took place during the Depression years. It was just easier to make a living if all you had to do was catch what you needed to eat. And you could drink the water from the river, so you didn't have that to worry about. Economic pressure was one of the things, and improved living conditions. Of all things, many people found that they could move from the land in houses that they built out of pews. Does anybody here know what pews are in this sense? Pews are slabs of lumber that you could split out of hollow cypress logs. If you could take a cypress log, and this is what happened when the timber companies cut the big cypress trees down, a lot of times, many times I should say, the bottom 10, 12, 20 feet of the tree would be hollow. It would have a circular slab of wood all the way around the hollow space. That wood would be very sound wood, very good wood. It might be 10, 12 inches in diameter, all the way around that hollow spot. Cypress being what it is and splitting like it is, you could take a wedge and you could get to the top of, well, first of all, you cut a section out of the cylinder like 6, 8 feet high. You could take a wedge and split any width of lumber you wanted, as wide as that piece of wood, what they call the meat of the log, all the way around. Those pieces you split off were called pews, P-I-E-U-X. I understand in French, and I don't speak French, I understand in French that it means picket, for like a picket fence sort of thing. So, a lot of people lived in houses that were built entirely out of these pews. Well, this is not finished lumber, and there were cracks. Sometimes they were sealed up effectively, sometimes not. There were cracks in the houses, and in the 1920s, late 1920s, early 1930s, lumber began to be available from the sawmills that you could take a log, of course, you assume it was your log, you could take a log to a sawmill and they would saw it for you, saw it into usable lumber for half. You took half, they took half. No questions asked about where the log came from. And that lumber was some of the first lumber that was used to build the houseboats in the 20s and 30s. And so people moved away from these living conditions that were drafty into houseboats that were better built. They also, we'll get to this in a minute, just an idea of what that first generation looked like. I love these old pictures. These people had character. Look at that guy's smile. This one. Where did they make that conversion? Where did they make that transition? Most of all, most of the time it was near sources for help. The help that they needed was mostly family. And there were always people in these families who were carpenters. Of course, you didn't need electricians or plumbers, but good carpenters were what you needed. And you could get near somebody or a group of people who were good carpenters, and they could help you build your house, and they often did. Not every place in the basin was equally friendly to houseboat communities. You had to have a place that was protected from open water, to protect, of course, from the wind, from the waves. It had to be something that had trees near the bank in such places that you could tie off your houseboat. So certain of these locations were better than others. It ended up that there were 10 eventual sites in the basin that housed most of the houseboats that came to be there. And of course, near sources of lumber, that meant that you had to be near logs that you could find and get to the sawmill. And this is where those 10 places were. Notice, with the exception of Mead Point, which is not a factor right now, this place right here is not a factor in our discussion at the moment. Only those places on the east side of the Atchafalaya Basin, that is on the east side of Grand Lake, were inhabited by people in houseboats. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it is the case. Starting down here in Morgan City, you have a place called the Pit. The Pit was a bar pit that was used to build the levee. It was a very popular place to pull into Morgan City if you needed a doctor, if you needed help, if you needed to visit somebody. You could tie up your boat, your houseboat, in this big bar pit and be in Morgan City for a while. Bayou Long, 4 Mile Bayou, Bayou Booty, Blazes Canal or Williams Canal, Blue Point, Big Pigeon, Little Pigeon, Keelboat Pass, Hog Island. Up here and here are some of the biggest concentrations of houseboats. When? They always had been in the basin. That is, they've been in the basin for a long, long time before we're talking about the Mead Point people. But the first generation that moved to houseboats of this community did so of the generation that was born about 1850. And we're talking about around 1875 when those people would have been maturing to a point in marrying and so on, beginning to have children. That would have been the first generation. Most of the Mead Point families began moving in the late 1800s when the second generation was born, was maturing actually in 1875. Those that were born in 1875. So the real group that we're talking about is around 1900. And much of the third generation was born about 1900. They birthed their whole families on houseboats. So they had the greatest exposure to houseboat living, was this third generation. How much exposure did they have? Nobody in this community was born and died on a houseboat, unless there were children who were, died of natural causes or accidents or whatever. But people who lived their whole lives did not die and were born on a houseboat. They spent some part of the middle of their lives, sometimes 50, 60 years. But I was making the statement for a while that these people lived and died on houseboats, and I realized that's not true. But they spent a long time. How did they make this transition? They learned to build barges. The barges were a peculiar set of things to be built that depended upon your being able to use cypress. The gunnels on these barges, as you'll see in a minute, the sides of these barges were 30 inches high, usually by 3 to 4 inches thick, and 30 to 40 feet long. That's a big piece of wood. It took a big cypress tree to get that. They learned to build boats. They learned to travel on the water. And mostly, at least, to do without the things that land provides. They did use some land when they could, when the water was low enough to grow gardens and things like that. The houseboats that they built and they lived on was something you might call the houseboat unit. It usually had these three things, not an outhouse particularly, but it had these three things. The houseboat itself was usually 3 rooms. Like I said before, the biggest ones were 30 feet long. The cabin was 30 feet long. The biggest ones were 15 feet wide. That would have been this whole structure right here. Typically, they had windows in each room, door in each end. Sometimes there was a door in the side. You see the walkway around it? It almost always did not have railings on it. These children, 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, were always outside playing on the outside of these houseboats. No railings. Very few times you hear there being any problem with that. They ran around, they just don't seem to have gotten in trouble. They did fall off. But that's one of the nice things about having a large family is usually, and around you, because there were usually 2 or 3 of your brothers and sisters that would grab you by the leg and pull you back up. Some of the 2 other features that were here would be this big raft here called a crib, C-R-I-B. It's composed of cottonwood logs, only cottonwood logs because they float the longest, topped by some sort of decking on the top. That was your backyard when the water was high, when you didn't have land to walk out on or anything. This is where everything else had to be done, was on the crib. Most people had one associated with the houseboat. And of course, thirdly is the boat itself that you used to move around in. In the early years, before the gasoline engines, and even in many cases afterwards, this is the kind of boat they had. It's called a push skiff. Many of you have seen them or familiar with them, I'm sure. You can see them in St. Martinville every year for that festival they have in the fall with some really pretty ones there. They're recreations, they are, these old boats. And you would literally push them. For those of you who haven't seen it, the motion is you would stand in the boat and you had these 2 big oars, and you literally would push the oars forward, and that would make the boat go really pretty well. You could really get places with it, within reason, of course. Another angle of the same thing. They often had, in the early days, they had cypress shingle roofs. They caught on fire a lot. This is the real thing. Notice that you carpenters out there, what do you call that? A hip roof when it's angled from the gable? Is that what you call that? The other style was the one that's next to it is round roofed. It's actually round with tar paper on it. But that's considered to be a big, big family houseboat. Dan Lang's boat. This is just before 1948. This is just before they began to move their houseboats over the levee, but I'm getting ahead of myself by saying that. Now, basically the houseboats are all gone. You can still find some in places like Bayonne, for instance, near Morgan City. If you drive the back roads, you can see the cabins have been, the barge is gone, but the cabin is still there. It's supported on blocks. And some people are still living in these 3-room shotgun cabins. They usually have a little side room built onto them, and of course that's the bathroom, because we didn't have them. Now, the reason this picture is up here is these 2 men on the left side, Terry and Bobby Anselm, are from Morgan City, and they are 2 of the people that can still supply the old heart cypress, the original cypress. And by original, I really mean that. Their grandfather had a source of cypress logs that he accumulated in Bayou Booty in about 80 feet of water. He sunk them. They were sinkers. I mean, that type of cypress, of course, didn't float. Too full of sap. So they sunk. He bedded logs in Bayou Booty. Nobody knows how many. Hundreds for sure. And they're still there. And they're covered with about 20 feet of silt now. But these 2 fellows, grandsons, have a barge with an excavator on it, and when they want some logs, they can go and pull off enough of the silt to reach the logs, reach down, pull them up, put them on land, and let them dry. They still can provide the original heart redwood cypress, the Anselm brothers. Now, this is their connection to this talk, this moment right here. This houseboat is one of the few that you can still get a really good look at the dimensions. Now, it has been modified a good bit. The 2 people you see in the picture, Chip and Patsy Metz from Morgan City, Patterson, they bought the houseboat and pulled it up on the bank in Bayou Teche and made a bed and breakfast out of it.
some of the folks here with us tonight have been in that bed and breakfast back there. It still has the barge under it, and that's what's different. Everybody else pulled these things up, lifted it, pulled the barge out. The barge was full of valuable timber, lumber. They sold those huge gunnels. They sold the rest of the wood. All went away. Of course, Chip Metz, being a doctor, probably didn't need to do that. So they left the barge under there. 2 years ago, I got permission from them to go inside and take pictures and measurements of the barge. And very few people get excited about this, but I was excited. There was really something. I mean, it was like walking into a cathedral or something for me, getting underneath inside this barge. I was 68 years old at the time. That's a 30-inch clearance. Not a good thing to do. Okay? But I got a lot of good pictures, and I got measurements of the whole thing. This is one of the few barges that they took the trouble to curve the bow and stern. Most of them used a straight piece for the bow and stern, just angled up like that. These, they took the trouble to curve, and they're beautiful. These are hand-cut. So, what did the barge look? I had to show this because I went and walked around, crawled around in that thing. You have to see this picture of what the measurements were like. 33 feet long, 15 feet wide, 30 inches high. The gunnels are 30 inches by 3 inches thick. That's a big piece of wood. How they built these things by hand, no mechanical equipment. That's not an easy thing to do. That's a big structure to build and maneuver by hand. Also, when you built it, you had to put a bottom on it, right? You couldn't put the bottom on it if it was right side up. So you had to build it upside down. You got this tremendous tons and tons of wood upside down. You got to turn it over by hand. That's another story. They did that 2 different ways. It was wonderful. Okay. So that's how they lived. That's what they lived in. The next thing is they had to travel. They had to go from place to place. They had to make a living. They had to go visit people. So they had to have boats. The first boats they had, they didn't do these. You had to go pretty far back to find the dugouts. But they did have the dugouts in the basin. During historical times, people did make these dugout canoes in the basin. This one happens to have surfaced. It's a historical one, which means it's been made in the last few hundred years. This one came out of a spoil bank in Grand Isle after one of the hurricanes. Floated out of the spoil bank. It's a beautiful thing. When this one was made, they had iron tools. But when the Indians made exactly the same thing, you familiar with the fact that they made them with fire only? That's all. You would burn the tree down at the base, fell these huge cypress trees slowly, and then light fires and charcoal, and then scrape the charcoal out with shells to make boats like this. Amazing. But they had pirogues. Pirogues had limits. Anybody can tell what the limits are? Yeah. You can only carry so much. Then you run out of room. I hope nobody knows who these folks are. No, you don't. But everybody had pirogues. Pirogues were the bicycles, if you will. They were everywhere. Everybody had them, and they used them for a lot of things. Pirogues gave way to push skiffs, which is what we talked about earlier as one of the things in the houseboat. This is how they were used, standing up. These are beautiful boats. The lines are gorgeous. You can only see the sidelines on this, but if you looked at it from the top, you would see the same degree of grace with the lines. How they go. They're absolutely gorgeous boats. You almost never see old push skiffs because it's too late. They're gone. When you do find one, they look like this. We found this one 2 years ago in Sharon, and it was on its way to the dump. And I have friends who are energetic enough to attempt to rebuild this boat using the pattern that you could take off of what was left of this one. So we took this one apart very carefully, including, you can't see it, unfortunately. Why do I point out something you can't see, right? But right up and down here is what we call the head block of this boat. I'm sure that there are other names for it. If you don't have a head block that's accurate, you can't build this boat, apparently. That's what I'm told. The head block shape determines the rest of the boat. The curve, everything depends upon the shape of that head block. And we didn't have anybody who could build one. But when we found this one, it had enough of a head block left to be able to take it apart and try to use that as a pattern. So that's what we did. It was in bad shape. The boat was built in about 1939. So, we got some wood from these folks in Morgan City, the Anselm brothers that I told you about. This is some of the original hard cypress. This board is like, I think it's 20 inches or 21 inches wide, an inch thick, and 18.5 feet long. That's a beautiful piece of wood. We got the old wood. We finally did get the head block to fit right. And last Saturday, this is what it looked like. So there's considerable progress. I'm real pleased with the way this is. This is like recreating something from a museum that almost no one knows how to do anymore. And these two guys have never built one of these either, but they're also master boat craftsmen. And they think they can do anything. And I'm not going to tell them they can't. Some of you know this guy on the left. Oh, Ray Brasser can have a good time around a boat anytime. He really enjoys this. He's part of what we're doing. From the push skiff, interestingly, it's hard to go back and think about, from manpower, when did you get something that wasn't manpower? Anybody know approximately, guess, at when the first usable gasoline engines, marine engines were available? Not bad guesses. That's what you call them, putt-putts, that's right. The first ones, the first Lockwood Ash inboard engines were invented in about 1905. They didn't catch on in the basin for some reason. I wish I knew the answer to this, but they didn't catch on in the basin and become really popular until about 1917 to 1920. Why? I don't know. But this is what they first looked like, the boats that they were put in, the first putt-putts. And this is 70 years ago, every body of water, if you were out around it, you heard pop, 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 and that was the engines in these boats. There were two types of engines. The Lockwood Ash engine had two types. One was a single cylinder and one was two cylinder. And the single cylinders were 2.5 horsepower, and most everybody owned one. Can you imagine today, 2.5 horsepower? 2.5? Trolling motors have more horsepower than that today. 2.5 horsepower. But they pushed these things because of the way the boats were built. The boats were built to slide through the water, not to get up on top, not to push, but to slide through the water. Long and skinny, narrow bottoms. This is what the old ones look like. They're not so ho-hum today. They're beautiful, the ones that they're building today. Some of these are old boats that have been reconditioned. Some of them are brand new based on designs of the old boats. They all have the Lockwood Ash engines in them. These are all two-cylinder engines. You can see they have two spark plugs on the top. These are probably 6 horsepower, maybe 8 horsepower. They go about 8 miles an hour on the water. The 2.5s went about 4 miles an hour. But if you were put, as I'm told often, if you were pushing the skiff down by you, and you were pushing, and you were getting a lot of speed out of it, and somebody came by you at 4 miles an hour, it would look like you were standing still and they were lightning fast. Everybody then had to go get one of those 2.5 horsepower Lockwood Ash engines. So those are the 2 cylinders. The 1 cylinders, you can see they have only a single spark plug in the top. These were the pop-pop engines. Okay. So we have the pirogues and the push skiffs, which led to the bateaus and the small inboard marine engines. And I like to think of this as one of those best examples of an idea whose time had come. About 1950, the first reliable outboard motors became available in the basin. People like Wizard made them, and other people made them too. But this made the difference. This was a complete change from what had been available before 1950 to now. And the difference was these boats were built to plane on the surface. They were built to plane on the surface. Now, what did that do? It meant you could cover 10 times the territory that you previously could cover with a boat that got on the surface and went 25 to 30 miles an hour. Just think of the difference between 6 or 8 miles an hour and 30 to 30 miles an hour. Huge difference in the territory you could cover, the lines you could set, fish you could catch. Am I fading out? Okay. So, they took these outboards, and to make a living with them, they had to do a lot of things. Everybody in the basin had these things available as for ways for them to make a living. Fishing was probably, we always think of fishing as the primary way to make a living. I know it's thinking you now. But fishing was, even though it was primary, it was a long way from the only thing that was available. We don't often think of the timber industry as an important way for these houseboat people to make a living, but it was there. It was always there. The whole time the timber industry was operating, it was always available to these swamp people to make a living from, and they always welcomed the work. There was no turning down people who would pay money for things that you did all the time, like run boats and know about motors. They collected moss, which many of you know became the early Model A, Model T upholstery. They dried the moss and sold it. They did a lot of trapping, which this fellow apparently, boy, he must have cleaned out the raccoons in that place, huh? Man. Hunting. We don't like to think about it sometimes, but people made a living in those days, sometimes commercial hunting, things we consider to be protected these days. Ducks were a big factor in that. Crabs were caught, they were sold. Crawfish were caught in the early days and were not sold. There was no market for crawfish. Crabs there was, not crawfish. And alligators were always around when they were still abundant. People did harvest them and sell them. Fishing could be divided into that with hook nets or with lines. We're not talking much about hook nets because most of the people in the Point didn't use hook nets. Most of them used lines. But this fell, oh, by the way, this slide was taken 2 days after Hurricane Andrew. Look how thin the willow trees are behind this guy. That was solid, thick forest 2 days before this. The interesting thing is Pete is harvesting as big a catch as he can handle 2 days after Andrew from the deeper water using nets. Fish were abundant, many, many fish. Line fishing was most of what Mia Point did in terms of fishing. This is of course what you would expect. This is a line strung out or some other way deployed with a hook on it, and you baited it individually. There were 6 kinds of lines that they used. Bush lines, which were set to catch big fish in the woods usually. They're outlawed now because the hooks tend to be dangling in the air if they're not attended. Tight lines, bent lines were used to cover wide territory. Cross lines is what you consider trot lines, a classic kind of trot lines. Jug lines for garfish and snag lines, which were a great deal of trouble. Snag lines could be 200, 300, 400 feet long with a hook every 4 inches. It hooked everything that came by. Some of the gear that they used, this is the things that they used to attach to the main line. The main point of this slide is that odd looking swivel in the hand. Fishing in current, you had to have some way to allow the fish to twist. Because in current, a catfish will hook itself and it starts this, twisting round and round and round. It twists the line all the way up and then unhooks itself. So you had to have some way to let that fish twist and not twist up the line. Swivels, of course, is what you use for that. But this little gadget that you see was made out of a galvanized nail and a piece of galvanized wire. They invented this, at least Mia Point thinks they invented it in that community. Okay? Some of the women would produce these things and sell 150 of them for $1.25. And they worked wonderfully, as long as the head and the nail didn't wear out. You can imagine this thing spinning right here. And when the head and the nail wore out, it's gone. Very inventive. Nylon, we take it for granted that nylon is available and it's as durable as it is. But nylon wasn't always available, and commercial fishermen have used line for as long as they've been commercial fishermen. They used cotton rots quickly. Nylon was a huge improvement. So was stainless steel. Steel hooks in the Atchafalaya Basin, believe it or not, rust almost as bad as they do in salt water. I'm not quite sure why that is, but they do. The bait they used. River shrimp was the primary bait. I don't know how many of you might be familiar with river shrimp, but it is that animal right there. The big ones are about that long, and they are the year-round bait for commercial fishermen in the basin. Those 5 baits at the top, crawfish, white eel, live perch, and cut shad, those were the main baits that were used. The ones below were also used, but not as frequently as those. Notice the one on the bottom. Any idea what kind of soap that was? P&G, Procter & Gamble, a block of soap. I think Ivory looked a lot like that in the block of it. But you could cut it into little sections and put it on a hook, and it caught fish. You had to be careful, because if fish swallowed it, then the fish would end up tasting like soap. But then, of course, if you sold it before that happened, it wasn't you that found that out. Some of the baits that we used, I mentioned white eel. We don't have time to go into detail about any of these, but this is a little, actually an eel about 10 inches long that is lives in the muddy bottom of some of these lakes and can be caught at certain times of the year, 2 to 3 nights a year only. When the first north wind comes and blows it shrieking as hard as it can, and the temperature gets down to in the low 40s to high 30s, that's when you want to be out there in the boat catching these things as they swim out of these lakes. No, you really don't want to be there, but it's a lot of fun. It really is. And they are fantastic fish bait. Fantastic. But the winner of all of these is the river shrimp. A commercial fisherman in the basin who fishes 1,000 hooks for most of his life will end up handling something like 5 million of these shrimp during his fishing life. huge numbers of them. Most of them were caught using, in the old days at least, were caught using shrimp bushes. This is wax myrtle. Some people use willow, but it's not as good. Wax myrtle, where you tie the bushes into bunches like this, suspend them in the water from these poles, and you put several of these, actually several hundred sometimes of these bushes in the water to catch enough shrimp, and you go along and you dip the, keep doing that. You dip the bush up with this handmade nylon net, and you use them for bait. There are other ways to catch shrimp. A lot of people use traps now, and that works pretty well, but this is more romantic. And all of that work is for these three species of catfish. Eel cat is also a channel cat, known as the channel cat, the blue cat, and then the goujon at the bottom. The goujon was the prize of early commercial fishermen. Women would go out into the swamp and set bush lines, 30, 40 bush lines hanging from cypress limbs, bait them with live perch, and catch these goujons, sometimes 40, 50-pound goujons. Sometimes the fish weighed more than the young lady did. And they would do that in pirogues. Very capable people. Also, garfish had a sail sometimes, shoepig had a sail sometimes, gaspergou very rarely had a sail. So, wrong animal. Buffalo. Did I do that? Oh my God. Buffalo were best as cut bait. But they had, people caught them with nets, and they got shipped mostly to Chicago for the market. I don't know why, but they did. People like them in Chicago. Paddlefish. Some of you know what a paddlefish is. Somebody sometimes called a spoonbill catfish. They had a tremendous market in the early 1900s. Any of you ever tasted this fish? It's not worth trying. Really, it's not. They are. It's oily as, you know, and people think, some people think sac-a-lait are oily. My God, sac-a-lait tastes like cardboard. These things are really oily. But they had a good market for them. They're illegal to catch nowadays. Now, the fish boats. There had to be a link between the docks, which were around Morgan City, most of them, and the people catching the fish all throughout the basin. There had to be some sort of connection between those two parts of the system. And this is what the fish boat did. The fish boat left Morgan City, visited the sides of the basin, bought fish, and returned the fish to Morgan City. Some of them look like this. This was called a Monarch. It was about 80 feet long, about 12, 14 feet wide. It had a stern wheel on it, but it was a gas-driven stern wheel, not steam. Another style was the lugger style. This one is heavily loaded at the moment. You notice the way that they did this. Where this fellow is where the fish went into this big container in here. Here's that pipe that you could swing out and hang a scale on for the fisherman to weigh his fish. This back area was a store. I hesitate to say grocery store because it was an everything store. Everything these people carried, if the fisherman wanted to buy, they carried it. They visited all these people. It usually took them about 2 days, sometimes 3 days, to make the route from Morgan City. If I had lived at this time, that's what I would have wanted to do. That was so neat. Just to be able to show the route that these fish boats took. Some of the names of the people up there. Jew Robert Vilmo, his son, we'll talk about him in a moment. The route that they took from Morgan City was up this side of the Grand Lake, visiting these 6 concentrations of houseboats, mostly. 1 day to 2 days if they went to Baisheng, which was up here, they had put another day on it, and then back to Morgan City. That was the link that connected the fishermen to a source of income at the dock. Same thing. This fellow in the middle is the son of one of the fish boat operators. This is Robert Vilmo. His father was Jew Robert Vilmo. It wasn't actually Jew, it was D-I-E-U, but everybody pronounces it the other way. He told me the story about when he lived in the lake and his father decided that they should live in Morgan City instead. They came back to Morgan City and they began living there, and he had been going to school in Baisheng. Well, when he got to Morgan City, he started going to school in Morgan City, and the school children had a different orientation in Morgan City than they did in Baisheng in a lot of different ways, one of which was the food. Bob Vilmo's mother cooked homemade bread. She fried fish a lot. She had a lot of game. She was a typical Cajun swamp mother with the food that she cooked. When Bob started going to school, he made friends with this guy, this young man, this little fellow, and the little fellow would bring 2 sandwiches of bologna every day. And Bob didn't have bologna, and he kept looking at that bologna, and that guy looked like he enjoyed that bologna so much. So Bob went home one day and he asked his mother, he says, Mom, he said, they were doing better financially. He says, you think we can get some store-bought bread and some bologna, and I could have a sandwich out of that? And his mother told him, yeah, we can do that. So she went out and she bought a loaf of store-bought bread and 4 slices of bologna. And she made his bologna sandwiches the next day, and he was so proud. And he went to school, and he found a bench where his friend would sit and eat his sandwiches. He sat down next to him, and he looked at his friend and he said, I don't want your bologna sandwiches today. I have my own. So he unwrapped the paper from his bologna sandwiches and he took a bite of that bologna and he started to chew it up. And he spit it as far as he could. And he got home and he told his mother, he said, that stuff is terrible. He said, can I have my squirrels and my rabbit? No, and my fish gourmand? Mama, please, and my homemade bread. And of course they went back to eating the poor folks' food like he was raised on. Yeah. Yes, already. You didn't jump up and down like you're supposed to. I have to find a way to get to slide 95 real fast. Okay, we're going to go past, you're familiar with the timber industry and the fact that the steamboats pulled the timber out. The logs were joined together with chain dogs, which is what that is. That's a planing that pretty cypress that I was talking to you about. Carolyn, see what I did? Like that, okay? And she kept saying, you can't put that up there. You can't use that like that. So finally, there's nothing wrong with it. Except, I can't do it, she says. Partners. The women. This is a lot of the stuff. We're out of time. But the women had a tremendous role in this community. They were really life mates. This woman could throw 100 pounds, she's not quite 4 feet tall, she could throw a 100-pound tub of fish into the back of a pickup truck. She was awesome. And this was a queen and king of the community, Agnes and Meow Bailey. Food processes, so much different food. The old ways of preserving it with salt and lard in those big crocks. Whiskey roaches. When you got sick, you had tetanus or something, lockjaw or something, you took a bottle of whiskey and soaked some bigger roaches in it until for about a week, and then you used that liquid to cure tetanus. It worked. Some of the things that you went to a doctor for, and some of the things you didn't think it was necessary. Snake bite, you didn't go to a doctor for. Birth and death. By-sorrel mound. A lot of people buried their people on the by-sorrel mound. This is an Indian site that has been there for about 1,500 years, and innumerable people are buried on this mound, including a lot of people from Hog Island. Courtship and marriage. I have 3 complete stories in here of these 3 people, of their meeting, courtship, and marriage, which are interesting sometimes. Jump the broom. Some of you familiar with that term, jump the broom? If you really meant it and there wasn't authority around, you could jump the broom and act as though there was. A lot of accidents happen. People cut themselves. A lot of realize how much we wouldn't be able to do in 90 minutes. Baptist religions were the 2 big factors in the basin. Both of them had big missionary presences. The Baptists built a church on a barge and hauled it all over the basin. The Catholic priest got airboats and power boats that he built himself and went around and said Mass in the houseboats. Education, not much of it, but some of it. A lot of recreation, a lot of dancing. That's Sharonton Beach in the 1920s, by the way. Law and order. That's a very interesting factor here. Now, I'm going to take a minute just to mention it. There was no authorized law authority in the whole of Grand Lake. There was one in Baishane, but that was a long way away when things happened. No law and order. And yet, there was a relatively calm atmosphere the whole time. People seemed to know how much you could steal before it became a punishable offense, punishable by the person you were stealing from. How big a log you could steal without seeming greedy. Situations involving men and women, particularly other men's women, were almost always punishable by death, either to the person that got caught or both of them, often both of them. This happened a lot. There were a lot of situations. Game wardens didn't happen. I put this in here just because this is some of the colorful people that lived around Hog Island. Out here in the middle of nowhere in 1933, I wouldn't expect any of you to know who this person is, but, oh, I've got the wrong thing in my hand again. If by any chance any of you have ever seen this woman, a picture of this woman before? That's Huey Long's wife. Yeah. Did somebody know who she was? No? I thought I heard somebody say something. You did think it was her? Absolutely. Out here in the middle of the swamp. Now I am going to go. Okay. To go through these quick. This is trying to tell the story of why these people decided to leave the basin. So now we've got them into the basin, got them living there, now they have to leave. Why do they have to leave? Here's why they had to leave. Here's the places that the houseboats were congregated. You've kept track so far of where Miette Point is, where they ended up, right here. But right now they live all along here. In 1920, the water, it occurred to me I have to say this, the water is coming this way all the time, okay? This is north, it flows through the lake south like this, which means the sandbars that build up start up here and begin to come down the lake. In 1920, the sandbars were just about here. Notice this right here, Little Pigeon, the mouth of Little Pigeon. Keep that in mind as to where that is as you follow these sandbars. Okay, this is 1920. Everybody's happy. No problems. 1938, the levees are being built. water's rising, sandbar is coming down more and more. They're now past the mouth of Little Pigeon, okay? People are still thinking, okay, things are all right, not too much of a problem where we live. But here, 10 years later, 1948, everybody's worried. All of the places where these houseboats were tied, all these communities up here, are now being blocked from anything else by the descending sandbars. So you had the big immigration in 1948. Everybody decided that they had to make a decision. They had to go someplace. Some of them went to Morgan City. Some of them went north to Plaquemine. But most of the ones we're talking about that ended up at Meehat Point, they all came down from Big Pigeon, Little Pigeon, Blazes Canal, Blue Point, Bayou Booty. They all came down, came around the sandbars, and got into Meehan's Canal, right here. It was in 1948. After 1948, there's virtually no one left living on the east side of Grand Lake. So in 1948, they began to haul those houseboats over the levee. And they ended up, that's how they ended up on the back side of the levee. They literally hauled their houseboats, these houseboats like you see here, they hauled them over the levee to the back side, blocked them up on blocks, and like we said, they pulled the barges out from under them and ended up like that. That's where they lived for essentially the next 25 years, is where that was. Now, Grand Lake in 1958, they're all safely over here in the canal, in the community. The sandbars are really coming down by 1958. Look where it is, according to Little Pigeon. All of this. And in 1973, the sand is almost completely blocked, Grand Lake. And the community, as we pointed out, to begin with, is now back in here. We've gone the whole circle. They had to learn new ways to do things because they're on land now. They made the other transition from water back to land. They had to learn that they had to get groceries from somewhere other than fish boats. They had to find electricity, maybe someplace. Mail was something they'd never had. Cars. They learned that cars are not boats. Most of them bought cars and wrecked them almost immediately. There's something different about driving a car that you expect a boat to do that a car won't do. And they literally wrecked a lot of cars. Hopefully on the levee you couldn't get in too much trouble with that. Schools, long story about how their schools worked out. No more fish boats, they had to find docks. And new kinds of jobs. They continued to fish, but they could now get employment in the sugar mills. This is Oak Lawn Sugar Mill. They could get employment in that sugar mill if they wanted to. They could get employment in the oil industry, and they did for 24 years. A lot of the young men worked in the oil industry. But in 1973, we had a big high water. You remember that? You remember how the Morganza floodway almost came apart? The Mississippi almost took over the Atchafalaya, scared the Corps of Engineers to death. The levee, you can see, well, you can't really see the levee in here, but the levee on the back side of this, the water came within 2 feet of the top of the levee. 2 feet. That much. You could walk on this side of the levee when the water was that high, and the ground would shake like jelly. It was scary. It really was. So the Corps decided that they needed to raise the levee, and all of the people who were in these 32 households and everything had to move because they had no legal right to be where they were. So they all had to move in 1974. This is what happened. Now, I know I'm out of time, right? Out? I have one thing I'd like to read for you. I'm glad I didn't take the time to read all of the things I had designated. If you notice this little icon while we're going through here, right here, on a lot of these slides, one of those I was supposed to read you a quotation from here, and didn't. So I'm glad because there was no time yet. This was Dorothy Cavalier, who's one of the people who lived in this community, still lives in the outskirts of it. And she's talking about how pleasant life was for young people in the swamp on the houseboats. She was born in 1938. She says, I found out now just how unique it was. I never can remember us going to bed hungry, never. And my daddy worked hard to find things to kill for us to eat. But it was a different time. It was easy. I thought it was easy anyway. We were happy people, and we thought everybody lived like that all over. We didn't think there was anything different. And when we started going to school, we learned just how different we were from the rest of the people. We were slower in living, you know. In other words, we stopped and smelled the roses, I think is what I'm trying to say. I want to thank these families who took the time to give us this information that we can share now with everybody. This is a portion of them. I want to also thank Darlene Sule, who also took the time to copy all of the black and white photographs that come from all the people that were part of this community and made them available to me. A lot of the information that I have here, about 10% of the information that's in this talk is in Riverlaw, the blog I write. And if you'd like to try that, as quite a few people here have, I'm pleased to see. Please do so. My cell phone, my email address there. And thank you for coming and listening to this tonight.
Thank you guys for coming out. Like I said, we're very excited to have such a wonderful crowd this evening. We are a little bit over time, but I think that's just fine because we have a good crowd, and I think you guys might have some questions for Jim. And if you do, I would like to invite them.
That's a mechanical. How is the houseboats pulled over the levee? There was a couple of ways they pulled it. They invented a windlass. Those of you know what a windlass is, like on a ship where you raise the anchor. It's a pivot that you can, in this case, you put a mule on a long arm around this pivot, and you walk the mule around, and you wind a line around this thing as the mule walks around. They pulled the houseboats up to the top of the levee like that, and then put the whole arrangement down below the levee at the bottom, hooked to the houseboats again, and pulled them down the levee on the other side. That's a good question. A good question. Anybody else? How do they keep the fish fresh? When they lived on the houseboats, and the fish boats were how they communicated with their buyers, if you will, the docks, the fish had to be alive. There was no ice. You think about these conditions, and it's very hard to imagine how you could have functioned under those conditions. There was no ice, there was no way to preserve food, except with salt and lard. You sunk it in a broth. But in the fish, you had to go out with some of these, and this is another thing that ties in, these slow boats we're talking about, the 2.5 horsepower lockwood edge, pop, 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 or the push skips. You go out and you catch your fish that you had set lines for, and you had well boxes in your boat, and the well boxes you kept full of water, and you put the fish in the water in the well box, and you got back home as fast as you could to keep the fish alive. Remember that crib I talked about that was the essential part of the houseboat setup? Well, in that crib there was a hole cut out, and you had a cypress slat box sunk into that crib, and you offload your live fish into that box. Then when the fish boat came, you had to net your fish out of that box. It's called a fish car, by the way, C-A-R. and that you had to keep your fish alive. It's just a factor of how the life was a different pace, because it didn't pay you to catch 500 pounds of fish. You couldn't keep them alive till you got home. It was self-regulated, so. Good question, thank you. Somebody else. Yes? Oh my goodness, I wonder if somebody would ask that. How did they turn the barges over? The most interesting way was they would build them near water, so that when you had to, when you finished with it, when you needed to turn it over, you could pull it out into the water and get it in deep enough water, like at least 15 feet of water, probably closer to 20 feet of water. And 3 or 4 men stood on one side of the barge bottom, and it began to sink. Right? It's sitting in the water like this. It began to sink like this. And they had a boat. They had a rope tied. It was on the lower end right here. And the boat was over there. And the boat would start pulling. And these guys were standing on the barge. And the more it would go down, the more the boat would pull. And it would try to pull this piece out. And pretty soon the whole thing would just whoosh, float up, right side up like that. And then 3 or 4 guys on the backside would get the hell out of there as fast as they could to keep from being hit by the barge. It was, I'm constantly amazed at the inventiveness that these folks used just to keep going. Thank you. No? That's another good question. Do you know the answer to that? That's such a good question. It sounds like it formulated from knowing the answer. That's great. What would you consider staples? What would you consider staples to someone who lived in these conditions? You don't want scurvy, so yeah. So they had to be citrus of some kind. They usually grow their own, by the way, on high mountains. Orange trees in the basin. What else? It had to be non-perishable. Right? Beans, somebody said. Beans. All of those things were essentials on these houseboats because you could store them dry. Flour, of course, everybody made what they call light bread, as opposed to pan bread, which is fried in a skillet with grease. Light bread is, like you're familiar with, it's with yeast. They made it every day, and the children ate it with pet milk, and if they didn't have pet milk, they put hog lard on the bread and black pepper, and that was a snack. And they all died of heart failure. No, I'm kidding. No. Bless our hearts, they did. But all of those essentials, all of those dry ingredients, those were the main ones. They ate beans almost every day. White beans, by the way, not red beans. White beans, navy beans, almost every day. Big thing. And game, of course, they supplemented there was no meat, no beef meat. Except if the fish boat would have some meat on it, they could buy meat to eat that day. Because once it left the fish boat, there was no ice to keep it cold. Vegetables. They didn't eat much in the way of vegetables, believe it or not. They really didn't. Now, those of you who are nutritionally oriented probably know that if you take beans and rice, it's almost a complete amino acid mix. Anybody is free to correct me on that, please, but that's what I've always heard. So the white beans and the rice would have been a huge proportion of the nutrition that you would need every day. Meat, almost always wild game. Almost always. Lots of squirrels, lots of ducks, lots of deer. Makes me hungry. Lots of growbacks. Ibises. Yes, sir. Say again, please. Wild greens. Wild greens? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 I asked this question too about vegetable matter in greens, and they did that. They did some of that, but nowhere near what we think of today as you know, they just did it. Thank you for that question. Yes. How did they interact with the Native Americans of this area? First of all, do we know what Native Americans they were? Yes, we do. Chitimacha, exactly. They were the Indians that were there, and they were where they are now. They were at Sharonton. The fishermen at Mia Point and the Chitimacha always functioned together, functioned in the same way, side by side, but never together. And I don't know how else to put that. They really got along real well, especially at fights on Saturday night at Sharonton. The Indians would go to their fight, to Sharonton Dance Hall. Mia Point people would come to Sharonton Dance Hall. And people would come from Jeanerette and Baldwin and so on to Sharonton, to the dance hall. They would all imbibe, but they, you know, and about 10 o'clock, everybody was looking for somebody to have some problem with. Well, there were about a half a dozen very large Native American men, and they always won the fights. So Mia Point would always side with the Native American men. And, but as far as I know, everything I've heard is they got along very well together. They had the same way of life. I heard one other one before.
You used the term lard. Where did they get the lard from? Did they raise pork?
Where did they get the lard from?
Where did they get the lard from?
Look at them raise pork back in the States.
Most of the time, before 1935, you see, just a tiny bit of background. Before the levees were built, the water didn't rise and fall in the basin like it does now. Before the levees were built, a 2-foot rise in the spring was considered to be high water. 2 feet, this much. Now, 18 to 20 feet is considered normal. 2 feet. So that meant there were a lot of natural bayou banks out there, natural bayou banks that didn't submerge every year. So you could have pigs, you could have cattle. Well, sometimes they had cattle, but you could have chickens and things. Well, the pigs, just like we do now, an annual butchery, usually in February, January, and they would render the fat. The Lord would come from that, for the most part. If they didn't do that, you could buy it in 5-gallon cans from the fish boats. And what did they use it for? If you put cooked game down in those 10-gallon crocks, a layer of cooked game on the bottom, cover that with lard, put another layer of lard all the way to the top of that 10-gallon crock, it will stay there for a year. And you could pull that rabbit out, that squirrel out, heat it up, cook it again with rice, put some onions in it, it's just like it was fresh. I have never done it, but that's what I'm told. That's where they got the lard, as far as I know. Where's one final question? Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yes, there's some books up there on the table.